It's great to be here in Prague. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the problem of malware attribution and how machine learning and AI can help. This is a very large collaborative team that is involved in this work, involving people from NYU, where I am, and my longtime collaborators at the Army Research Laboratory, some people who aren't there anymore, and George Washington University and a number of other places. So the question that we've been looking at is, if you have a piece of code, who wrote this code? And I've been doing research for many years on this question of stylometry, of whether sort of the style of your writing can identify who you are. And we all kind of write a little differently. But as I've been doing that work for many years, people would be like, well, speaking to computer scientists, well, what about code? We don't learn code in quite the unconscious way that we do, but most people who've spent any time programming have seen that people have their own little tics. So the scenario that we've been interested in is this idea of you have some sort of library of malicious source code, and sometimes you actually do have the source code. Some of you guys have probably seen the source code to various malware type things that are written, for example, in Python, or in cases where the code is actually leaked. But we'll get to binaries too. And then Bob has this source code with known authors, and he's going to try and see if the adversary is in this collection. Now, I have a little bit of ambiguity about the social good, as it were, of this kind of work. Because this is a picture of Salik Malipur, who was arrested and actually sentenced to death in Iran for writing file uploading software that was used in a porn site. And there isn't a lot of difference in this case in terms of security enhancing and privacy infringing technologies. And this attribution work, in the case of malware, it's actually much harder to get it to work because of packers and because of various things that people do to strip software. But worrying about the kind of harassment that someone might experience from the state or from other individuals and so on online is something that happens there. So I want to mention that and give it some framing. We'll get back to the notion of social good at the end of today. But OK, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do this source code attribution from a technical perspective, and then what we would do when we were trying to go to binaries. I'll talk a little bit about malware, and then if we have time, I'll talk about incomplete fragments of code. So the general pipeline that you have is you have some code that gets the source code that gets processed into various feature vectors, largely involving parsing things into abstract syntax trees, and then classified using random forests. So how well does it work? It works pretty well. So on a smaller problem where you have, say, 250 programmers, sometimes you can get 98% accuracy. If you scale that up to 1,600 programmers, it drops down to 94%. So it degrades pretty gracefully in this sense. And this is actually this is from work published in Usenix in 2015, and at the time this was increasing both the accuracy and the scale by about an order of magnitude in terms of work that had been done previously on this type of problem. So what are we doing? This data set that we've done this examples on is not malware. We'll get to that later. We're looking at programming competition stuff, in particular Google CodeJam, which is really nice as a rigorous data set that allows you to look at a whole bunch of different people from around the world coding the same problem, so it's very controlled and individual. And we use Yorn. We've also used Clang more recently to parse ASTs and extract the features, and we build random forests and work from there. So in general, this is what an abstract syntax tree looks like. Basically, all compilers build them when they're trying to compile code. It basically looks at the types of structures that you have that your code is the if statements and the branches and so on. And some people, and this is a large way in which people's style is differentiated in terms of some people have longer, narrower trees, and some people have broader, wider trees, depending on the way they code. So, one of the things that people often ask is like, have you figured out who Satoshi Nakamoto is, who wrote Bitcoin? And the answer is, we have not done that experiment. But if you were interested in doing it, this is how you would go about doing it using our approach, which is you need a suspect set. So you need a number of programmers that you think could be Satoshi. And you would train on the suspect set by abstracting sort of lexical and layout and syntax features to get this initial Bitcoin, and then you look at the initial Bitcoin offer and you test. And like I said, this is not an internet scale type of problem, so you do need this suspect set, but it can be reasonably large. In this case, we looked at over 14,000 files and 1,600 authors. And a natural question, especially in light of sort of all the work that we're going to talk about later today on adversarial machine learning, is sort of how hard is it to fool this type of system? And the answer to that is it's pretty hard using like sort of standard off-the-shelf type of techniques. So this is an obfuscator called Stunix, and it does things like it replaces, it makes the code look like this. Basically, it'll replace your variable names and your white space and your layout, but it doesn't actually touch the abstract syntax tree, so it doesn't actually really substantially reduce the accuracy here. Now, there are other types of function virtualizers, for example. This is Tigris, and it will take your code that looks like this and make it look something like this, so it's very maintainable at this point. And also has about a 10-fold kind of overhead in terms of runtime slowdowns. So, but it does actually improve. It does actually help you obfuscate the authorship are in a 20 author set. So this is smaller. It's an easier problem. And it reduces the accuracy to 67. Now, this is still not great, but it turns out like if you actually sort of target, like in all adversarial example work, if you actually target the actual algorithm that we're using and try and find things, then things work much better. There's actually a paper, not by us, in Unix Security 2019 that if you think this is interesting, I encourage you to look at. They use Monte Carlo tree search to actually find code transformations that will fool this approach, and it works very well. It reduces the accuracy to around 1%, and it allows various imitation attacks. So does this mean that this isn't useful? Well, I mean, it depends if the person that you're trying to find is actually running this kind of analysis on their code and making it misattributable or not. So yeah, so that's some of that. And I'm going to now kind of switch gears and talk about binaries, because this is the sort of thing that is kind of, it's impressive that it works at all, right? Because source code, when you compile code, it looks very cryptic. We've reduced all our nice like source code features to various things, and and it would be nice to be able to do this on malware, but malware authors largely don't necessarily give us source code, certainly not attributed, and and a lot of malware authors aren't necessarily known about these things. So how does this particular pipeline work? So in this case, what we do is this is a problem that people have looked at before, and largely in the past, they look at using disassembly and control flow graphs in order to get features to attribute the author. But what we do is we actually add a decompilation step so that we can actually recover some degree of the original source code and parse it into an abstract syntax tree. And this will allow us to do classification. Now, it's also important here that we actually, you have sort of a cursive dimensionality problem here where you have a lot of features and you can have horrible overfitting and things like that. So we do a lot of feature reduction there. So this is some example of the assembly features that we've used. And here's the abstract syntax tree features. Now we're using AST utograms and AST bigrams and overall depth of the AST. I don't know how much time I'll have to talk about it, but we have also looked at ways to use deep learning on the AST to learn using LSTMs different representations of the AST so that you can have sort of more complex dependencies that you learn. And here's the control flow graph. OK. And so as a whole, this gives you quite a few features, like over 700,000. So the first thing we do is we just look at information gain, which is looking at like sort of which features actually reduce the entropy of the interclass problem. And we can reduce our large feature set from about 700,000 to 2,000 doing that. And then we use some just correlation type work looking at the interclass and intraclass relationships. And this will let us reduce our feature set down to basically 53 features. So what are these features that actually on binaries are predictive? A lot of them are this sort of arithmetic type operations that we see in assembly. And also when we look at the abstract syntax trees, a lot of the ways in which people format and initialize variables and the way they use file and stream operators. And it's not entirely clear to what degree this is like perhaps a bit overfit to the Google CodeJam type problems, but they are pretty varied, and it has seemed to hold up in other places when people have looked at it. So another like caveat to this work is that we're using optimization. So we're assuming that we know what the compiler is that was used to compile this code, and that's actually not too hard of a sort of problem in that there's a lot of work out there to look at a binary and try and figure out what compiled it. But that is a dependency. The other question that comes up is what happens, especially when people are using different levels of optimization or stripping symbols. And we can see that optimization levels don't seem to have a huge impact. They do matter. It does sort of, if you're looking at 0 versus 03, there is like a 10% sort of accuracy hit there if you're sort of not using the one. But stripping symbols does matter, and that's something you'd expect to see in a malware binary, but not always. We have looked a little bit at sort of different ways to do types of simple obfuscations through instruction substitution and control flow flattening and things like that. Of course, if you use the methods that I talked about before from the Usenix paper in the original code, then that will also work here. But just doing, again, just sort of targeting sort of traditional obfuscation mechanisms don't seem to work very well. And it does scale pretty well when we look at going from 20 authors to 600. You do see more of an accuracy hit as you scale than in the source code case, but it's not too bad. Now, it is tricky to actually apply this in the real world. Like if we look at GitHub, it's difficult to like build data sets where you actually, especially if you're looking at single author rather than multiple authors. I'll get to multiple authors, hopefully. And so if you only have, say, like one project that is written by somebody to train on and another project, like so it's a couple files here and there to train on and a couple files to test on, then you'll get a pretty big hit, around 65% accuracy here. So in all these other cases, we assumed we had about 10 files to train on by a given author that was pretty well established. In the cases in like the GitHub sort of real world grab code from the internet situation where you do have that much training data, it does work similarly to other things, but that's something that happens. We were interested in malware, and our first experiment trying to find malware was to look at some of these online hacker forums where people are that have been leaked, where people actually sell malware. So we looked at null.io, and we found like 6 malicious programmers, and which is a super small problem, arguably, but we were able to attribute like that little small problem with 100% accuracy. So it's something good. And similarly, when we've looked at other small like problems where these were malware binaries from the zoo data set, and some binary files from the equation group, and we looked at and +5 like sort of unattributed samples that we added in there. And we were able to sort of correctly attribute the ones that were from the attributed set and the ones from the unattributed set. Again, the AST features were super crucial here. So these have been really small problems that I've demonstrated, that I've talked about so far in malware. And the problem is there just isn't like large data sets of malware that we actually have really good attribution information for to actually be able to rigorously evaluate this. If anyone has some, I'd be interested. We've done a little bit of work with sort of security companies here and there that have done some of this sort of manual attribution work with like reversers and things like that. And our work does seem to correlate with that, but it's something that we're still looking at. So one of the things we're interested in is like, could you do this in an unsupervised way? So I have a whole bunch of code in this case, or binaries, and we're interested in like, can we just cluster it into authors? Because maybe we can at least figure out like, which of these people both wrote the same thing in terms of attribution. So I say semi-supervised because, while again, this is like really good accuracy on this relatively small problem, it was super dependent on actually knowing what the number of clusters were, how many authors were there, and it was very fragile when you didn't have the number of clusters to give it. So there's some promise there, maybe not. Another thing that's interesting in trying to make this work is most people do not actually write code like individually like they would in a programming contest. Even in malware teams, it's usually teams, right? People are writing things collaboratively. So people have tweeted about this case about like, I'll believe code stylometry works when it can be shown on commit histories instead of the Google Code Gems. So we were obviously interested in doing this. And this is interesting also in the case for like when somebody is trying to contribute something on their own time that they might get into trouble for doing, either with their company or their government or anybody really, whether they can sort of count on anonymity there. So yeah, sometimes we only care who wrote a small piece of code. Sometimes we want to de-anonymize a pseudonymous account. So we can also, so in these cases, you only have like these small segments or snippets. So in this case, it's a really large problem. One reason that made it difficult is we could not do like the type of feature reduction that worked in the other cases. But if we're looking at, I went too far on this. We used 104 programmers in this case, basically randomly choosing files until you have 100 samples of training data. But some of these samples are super small. Like we're talking like 1 to 3 lines of code, whereas some of them are a little longer. And just doing a lot of cross-validation. And this was sort of our method here, where we're collecting data and then preparing it, extracting ASTs, and then trying to attribute single samples. What actually helps us here is that the errors tend to be uncorrelated. So if you actually have somebody who is committing under the same account and you want to attribute the account, it works a lot better because you can basically combine multiple samples until you do much better. So our base accuracy here was basically around 50% for the sample, per sample. Some authors were easier and harder to classify than others. So like if we bin them by author, in general, 61% of authors were attributable. But you can see that as you increase the number of commits that someone does, these accuracies start to get into this like 90% range, as we were talking about. I think I have a couple minutes. So I'll talk a little bit about deep learning, because it's the new hotness that's not that new anymore. So as I said, trees are not actually features, right? So we manually chose the features of the ASTs that we were using, and we again looked at like really broad things, features of the whole tree, and like really narrow like bigrams and unigrams of the leaves of the tree. So we're interested if a deep neural net could actually do better, and we wanted it to learn the structure of the AST, and we used basically an LSTM to do this, which asks sort of which features it should remember, which it should ignore, and which it should forget, so that it can learn like sort of sequential long-term dependencies within the code. And in general, if you're just using the AST features, so we're ignoring the layout features, we're ignoring the lexical features, we're just using ASTs, which in some cases, is maybe it's better for being harder to fool in some respects, then the LSTM and the bi-LSTM do better. But when you sort of integrate it with the random forest, it doesn't necessarily do much better. It's kind of questionable on Python code. So this is a different language. All the other stuff was done on C. And part of this was allowing us to look at another data set that we got from Nightline Security, from a well-known threat actor group. They didn't tell us which it was. They gave us some files, and we did some analysis on them and worked with them. And our analysis largely was correlated with their sort of manual work in trying to do this attribution. So thanks again to all of my collaborators at various places. And there's some more project information and code and things here. This is my old Drexel website, which I don't know how long it's going to last, but we'll see. But yeah, any questions?
Thank you. Rachel, there are plenty of questions.
OK.
So let me pick the first one. Is the decompiling accurate? Because very often the AST is not recovered and it is full of go-tos. Are there some kinds of post-processing of data?
So I guess there's this question of like, what does accurate mean? Like, you don't get like the actual original code. And if you were to do sort of feature extraction on the original code and then feature extraction on the like decompiled code, it would look differently. But it does correlate across. So what you do is if you compile and then decompile your training set and similarly, then you do see this correlation. So even if it's not like actually giving you the original code, there's enough like correlation with what the original code was and the style that it allows you to do this work.
The next one, given the features that survive in the end, how much do you believe they can really support explainability?
So, we haven't done like extensive explainability cases. I think in the events where in the cases where we're looking at like the sort of really clean problems, like the source code on like something like a Google Code Jam, and we're able to do like a lot of sort of feature reduction and then feature importance, and we're using random forest. So the nice thing about random forest is, you do get these decision trees, and you can see which features were most important in the decision. And so whether that, whether it's explainable to sort of a layperson, I'm not sure, but in terms of explainability to like a machine learning person, I think it's not too bad in that regard.
Not too bad. The next one, have you thought about using these techniques in the wild, where you usually have little to no data about code style of the attacker?
I did talk a little bit about some of the like very small experiments we've done that are more in the wild, where we're looking at code and binaries that we found on malware forums and things like that, and it does seem to work reasonably well in those cases. I will say that in some other cases, and I didn't, it is a little cherry picked here because there's definitely like malware that we found that we just like could not decompile, and so it didn't work very well. So that's definitely a big issue that comes into play in the wild for this type of problem.
And I like this one, that the comment that malwares are often shared or sold in markets, which are later slightly modified by other APT groups. So in this case, the author attribution could impact the accuracy of your model.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the reasons that we're so interested in this question of like these small snippets and whether you can attribute, sections of code, and so you can understand, where things, at the git commit type of level, where things have been attributed. Obviously, that seems to be much harder than attributing like a whole file, but it's still reasonably possible. So, yeah.
And there is also one, I was thinking about it because we use a lot of development and coding standards. So does this method even work for projects where you have these strict coding styled code reviews?
So I have a student that's actually looking at this question right now, and I think it's something we're really interested in. And if there are any companies, Avast or something, that are interested in kind of working with us on sort of organizational code like that we can understand the style guideline, we have looked a lot at GitHubs that sort of organizations put together, but they're sort of the work that we intended to do on organizational sort of stylometry and organizational style, and whether it sort of obscures individual style, there's a huge confounder. So the nice thing about like the Google CodeJam, and in some cases malware stuff, because you can kind of bin malware by the kind of thing it's trying to do, is it's all kind of everyone's kind of trying to solve very similar problems. So you don't have this weird confounder of this is code to like, serve website stuff, and this is like, back-end system code, and this is GUI code, and that type of functionality confounder can really mess things up. So that's an area where we're trying to do organizational work where the organizations are doing different enough things. Seems to be really like that type of confounder problem becomes a huge problem. So we've started to do a lot of analysis just of that, because it seems like and this is interesting for family classification potentially as well, is like when you're trying to if you give a bunch of code, like and you want it to find classes that are functions, that are different functionality, different tasks, then it works pretty well, not as well as author. But if you give it a bunch of authors, it'll find authors. So the question is, if you give it a bunch of sort of unknown mix, is it going to be like the functionality of the code or the style of the authors that it's finding? And it turns out that that's tricky. So
I will pick last question, and I think I will invite all those who keep asking. I think they will reach out to you during the break. But the last question is, did you try determining whether a code piece is by one or multiple authors? So answering the question whether Satoshi is one person or multiple.
So again, we haven't actually done any work on like trying to de-anonymize Satoshi. Satoshi can have their anonymity, and but there's this question about one or multiple authors is not something that we have results on yet. But I have a student right now that is looking at this question of like segmentation, of trying to take a piece of code and segment it. And it does seem to be hard. Like I said, we could do kind of the unsupervised case where we're trying to, like, if we know how many authors we can kind of figure out, but this question of is it one author or more than one authors, maybe just that question might be not too bad. There's some work with like written word stylometry where you can look at the differences between lines of code, like where things sort of shift and change. But yeah.
So thank you very much, Rachel. It was really interesting.
Thank you.